Page 179. 10 States of God is the main title. Subtitle State 6. Roman numeral 6. God as human soul in the state of reincarnation. Editor's note, see also Meher Baba, Reincarnation and Karma, Discourses, pages 301 to 338. The most finite first impression of the first urge gave to the infinite unconsciousness of the unconscious soul the most finite first consciousness. Gradually, varied and innumerable impressions experienced through varied and innumerable gross media gained greater and greater consciousness of the finite gross world for the soul. And eventually, the evolution of consciousness was complete when the consciousness of the soul identified itself with the most first human form. Therefore, the soul, having now gained full consciousness in human form, does not need any more or any other higher forms to evolve consciousness. The consciousness gradually gained in the process of evolution is full and complete in human form. Though the soul in this state has gained full and complete consciousness, it is still not conscious of its subtle and mental bodies, nor of its unlimited self as one, indivisible, eternal, and infinite. It is only fully conscious of its identity with human form and its varied aspects and experiences of the gross world. Consequently, the soul at this stage only fully grows conscious of the most first human gross form, and still unconscious of the subtle and mental, experiences in the gross world all of the impressions of the most last animal gross form, dissociated or dropped by the consciousness of the soul in the latest stage of evolution of consciousness. When all of the impressions of the most last animal gross form are exhausted through incessant experiences by the most first human gross form, then it is but natural that this most first human form is dropped or dissociated from the consciousness of the soul. This experience by the fully conscious soul is universally accepted as the death of the human being. As explained previously, although the consciousness of the soul gets dissociated from the most first human form, yet it can never get dissociated from the unconscious associations of its subtle and mental bodies. The consciousness of the soul retains and experiences the impressions of the dropped or dissociated most first human form through its subtle and mental bodies. In order to exhaust these impressions, the consciousness of the soul must necessarily associate with a gross form, and therefore it associates itself with the next human form to exhaust and experience the residual impressions of the previous human form dropped. In fact, this next human form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the past impressions retained of the previous body or human form that dissociated from the conscious soul. The association of consciousness of the soul with the next human form is universally accepted as the birth of a human being. In short, in state 6 of God as human soul, in the state of reincarnation, the soul has developed full consciousness in human form, and therefore there is no need for any further evolution of the gross form. The evolution of gross consciousness thus comes to an end with the attainment of the human form, and to experience the impressions sanskaras, cultivated in the human and the subhuman forms, the soul has to incarnate again and again into human form, into the human form. The kind of human forms with which the consciousness of the soul has to associate is determined by the nature of previous impressions, sanskaras, of virtue or vice, happiness or misery, and so forth. While experiencing the gross world, the soul identifies itself with the gross body, which is destructible, although the soul itself is eternal. In the subhuman stage, the evolutionary process of form and consciousness is involuntary, yet sustained and continuous, with no possibility of slipping down to the lower forms of evolution. In the human stage, which marks the end of the evolution of form and the attainment of full consciousness, the spiritual progress of man through the reincarnation and realization processes is voluntary and is also absolutely free from any danger whatsoever of slipping down to a subhuman state, except in flagrant misuse of the powers of the fourth plane. Once full consciousness is gained, it is gained forever and is never lost, and the evolution of consciousness is completed only when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with human form. Therefore, retrograde incarnation is an impossibility once the consciousness of the soul identifies itself with the human form. With the development of full consciousness of the gross world in the human gross body, the soul simultaneously is associated with the fully developed subtle and mental bodies. But as long as consciousness is confined to the gross world, the consciousness of the soul cannot make use of its subtle and mental bodies directly. The soul becomes conscious of these bodies and experiences the corresponding impressions of these bodies through the corresponding spheres of the subtle and mental worlds, only when full consciousness, which is conscious only of the gross at this stage, turns inwards toward itself, and the process of the involution of consciousness begins. This becomes possible only when the consciousness of the individualized soul becomes satiated with the incessant experiences of the varied and innumerable impressions of the material or gross life, and only when it has suffered oscillations between the opposites of pain and pleasure for what may seem interminable ages through the unfailing chain of births and deaths in the process of reincarnation. In the stage of evolution of consciousness, the winding process of impressions, sanskaras, is at work with a view to evolving consciousness, developing higher and higher types of gross forms. In the human stage, the fully evolved consciousness remains, but the grip of impressions, sanskaras, begins to loosen and thin out as a result of continuous jolts experienced by the consciousness of the soul through the seemingly unending chain of births and deaths in the reincarnation process. State 7. God, the title is God in the State of Spiritually Advanced Souls. After a long, drawn-out struggle with the life of the gross senses in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul begins to get drawn towards the self of the soul, rather than to remain focused on the gross body and its gross environment. After a number of births and deaths, the gross conscious human soul is at last inevitably drawn to embark upon the process which will lead the man ultimately to the goal of God realization in human form. The consciousness of the soul therefore begins to withdraw itself from the world of gross senses and is now ready to undergo the process of involution. The soul is thus said to advance spiritually through the subtle and mental spheres. The subtle sphere, or the subtle world, is the domain of the first three planes of the involving consciousness of the soul. The fourth plane lies between the subtle sphere and the mental sphere, and the mental sphere contains the fifth and sixth planes. The seventh state of God comprises the advance by the pilgrims on the spiritual path through the subtle and mental spheres. The greater the advance, the greater the involution of consciousness. When the soul becomes conscious of the subtle sphere through the subtle body, it identifies itself with the subtle body. And when it is conscious of the mental sphere through the mental body, it identifies itself with the mental body, just as it identified itself with the gross body when it was conscious of the gross sphere through the gross body. The spiritual progress of the soul through these spheres is entirely in imagination. The pilgrim's progress in the involution of his consciousness consists in replacing one realm of imagination for a better and higher level of imagination, right from the first through the sixth plane of involving consciousness. In the seventh plane, the involving process is complete. Imagination comes to an end, and reality is realized and is no longer a concept. Those who enter the spiritual path and tread upon it, without the help of a master to guide them, very often get lost in the labyrinth of sights and illuminations, and have little or no chance of redeeming themselves from that position. They are like children who, on their way to school, get distracted by the sights and attractions of the marketplace. The enchantment of the spiritual path is so great, and the enticement so intense, that even in the earlier stages of the journey, the pilgrim has a pseudo sense of God realization, from which he cannot emerge unless helped by perfect masters. Many an advanced pilgrim in the subtle sphere thinks that he has gained complete freedom from births and deaths, although this is not so. The delusion remains up to the sixth plane of involving consciousness, but it is most conspicuous between the third and fourth planes. The fourth plane of consciousness is the most treacherous stage in the pilgrim's progress, because this is the stage when all the powers of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere are under his direct command. The misuse of these powers means the downfall and disintegration of the consciousness of the soul. Though it is a fundamental fact that once consciousness is gained, it can never be lost, yet an exception to this rule can occur, but only at the fourth plane, where there is a good possibility of the consciousness gained by the soul being disintegrated. While it is never lost completely, it disintegrates as far back as the consciousness of the stone form. The whole process of evolution of consciousness then has to be repeated to regain the full consciousness and the human form. Thus it is that from the fourth plane, the pilgrim on the spiritual path may either fall back due to the abuse or wrong use of tajaliyat, cities, in parentheses, or progress or progress by further involution of his consciousness to fifth plane consciousness and capture the experience of the mental sphere or the mental world. Crossing the fourth plane and stepping into the fifth would mean gaining approach to the divine gate. In the sixth plane, the pilgrim sees God face to face. This seeing is through the mental eye, when the consciousness of the soul identifies the soul with the mental body. Even when the pilgrim sees God face to face in the sixth plane of his involving consciousness, the grip of duality is not overcome, because the seer and the seen are still differentiated through the seeing. Imagination on the plains ceases as soon as the pilgrim crosses the field of illusion and enters the realm of reality in the seventh plane of completely involved consciousness, where he is absolutely free of all traces of impressions. The seventh plane consciousness is full as well as mature, and is the impressionless consciousness which identifies the soul with itself. The soul then feels and experiences consciously its eternal existence as God. The drop, parentheses, soul, devoid of any bubble, parentheses, form of ignorance in illusion, realizes its eternal existence in the infinite ocean as the ocean itself, parentheses, the Paramatma or the Oversoul. Title coming up, State, Roman numeral 8, God as the divinely absorbed. This state of God signifies for the soul the end of the long evolutionary struggle, the end of the reincarnation process, and the end of the realization process through the planes. For the individual soul, there is no higher stage toward which to aspire, because it has reached the goal by becoming one with God. The God-realized pilgrim of this stage is known to the Sufi world as a Majzub, and the Vedantist calls him a Brahmi Bhut. The Majzub has no body consciousness and no consciousness of the three spheres, the gross, the subtle, and the mental. This means that in this state 8, God as Majzub consciously experiences his own infinite trio nature of infinite power, knowledge, and bliss, but does not make use of these infinite aspects of his nature. In this state 8, the unconscious infinite state A of God, the unconscious Paramatma, not only gains the highest divine consciousness of state B of God, the conscious Paramatma, but in this state, God becomes divinely absorbed in the reality of his own infinite conscious state, and thus realizes his eternal identity with the infinite conscious state B of God. This state 8 of God is this state 8 of God is of the highest divine consciousness, which is the Ahadiyat, parentheses, Halat Muhammadi, or the Vidyan,